welcome folks to our book club. Does that sound good to you?
Okay.
Awesome. Hey, y'all. Thanks for joining us here in the Zoom room or on Facebook Live, either at Blue Ridge Hiking Company, Jennifer Farr Davis, or over at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. We want to thank our nonprofit partners and all they do to protect and preserve the Appalachian Trail. And this is our third book in the Armchair Adventure Book Club this spring, Our Wild Calling by Richard Louv. It's a little more research-based than a lot of the adventure narratives that we read in our book club, but I found it to be such a powerful book. And I'm not surprised because I read, along with a lot of other people, Richard Louv's first book, and Last Child in the Woods was something that made me think really hard about my connection to nature, how I was introducing my children to it, and what we need to do moving forward as a culture to protect our natural resources and also for our own health to feel connected by them. So Our Wild Calling expands upon that and talks about our relationship and our connection to animals and how powerful it can be, how important it is. And I should start by introducing our author today, although he's so well known that I think most people tuning in are probably familiar with him. But let me just say this really quickly about Richard Louv. He is the author of 10 books, pretty prolific, including Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, The Nature Principle, and Vitamin N. He's been translated into 20 languages. His books have helped launch an international movement to connect children, families, and communities to nature. He is co-founder and chair emeritus of the nonprofit Children and Nature Network, which supports a new nature movement. Louv has written for the New York Times, Outside, Orion, Sierra, and many other publications. He appears regularly on national radio and TV and lectures throughout the world, although probably just from Zoom over the past year. In 2008, this is so impressive and well-deserved. He was awarded the Audubon Medal. Past recipients have included Rachel Carson, E.O. Wilson, and Sir David Attenborough. And you can check him out at his website, which is richardlouv.com. Now, Rich, we always try to do these book clubs for people who have both read the book and still might pick it up after the talk. So to get started discussing Our Wild Calling, I have 4 or 5 sort of rapid fire questions that you can answer with just quick 1 or a couple word answers. Does that work for you?
That's great.
Okay. I have them all about animals this time, no surprise. But do you have a favorite animal?
So these are one-word answers?
Or, 1 word, 1 sentence. You don't have to expound too much, yes, unless you want to, and you're welcome to.
Okay. Stopping before he expounds. Do you mean wild animal or domestic animal? Picky.
You can pick, or one of each.
Okay, well, domestic animal, we have 2 cats. Stray cats are driving us nuts. I love cats, but probably dogs more.
Yeah.
And wild animal, it's hard to pick. The deer, we were just talking, and where I live are everywhere. And every time they stop and put up their antenna and look at you, it's like the world stops.
Yeah, we have been camping at national parks as a family, and one of the coolest experiences is my 4-year-old saw a family of deer and started walking to it, and there was a fawn in the family, and the fawn started walking towards my son, and they just walked towards each other and stopped with about 15 feet of space and just looked at each other for, what seems like minutes, probably it's 30, 45 seconds, but it was so cool. Okay, what is one animal that you haven't seen yet in the wild that you would really like to see?
Well, mountain lion. We've got a lot of mountain lions up here in the mountain we live on. And I had a trail cam picture of a mountain lion in our yard, our property, in about an acre. And but that's the only one I didn't see it, but I got the picture of it, and it's pretty awesome. So I'd like to see one in person.
Yeah, I loved one of the natural. One of the naturalists in your, go ahead, sorry.
The
Well, I was
people,
gonna say one of the naturalists.
people up here say you don't see mountain lions, you see their tails as they disappear.
I was going to say one of my favorite quotes in the book was one of the naturalists you interviewed who, I think it was in Big Bend, saw a mountain lion at night. And he said, I've been waiting to see you my entire life. Like that's what his thought was when he saw the mountain lion. And I feel like there's a lot of people who probably feel that way about mountain lions.
Actually, that was Paul Dayton, an oceanographer. And it was a little scarier than just running into it. He was sleeping on the porch in the mountains on a cabin. And he woke up and the mountain lion, his face is just looking at him. It looks curious, doesn't look aggressive. And that's when Paul said, I've been waiting to see you all my life. And then the mountain lion leaped away. And as Paul put it, it went over the fence. And Paul said, mountain lions don't jump, they glide. So,
yeah, well, I would prefer that my encounter maybe isn't quite that close. Able to see a mountain lion, but that was a very memorable story from the book.
Yeah.
What was your first pet or your most memorable pet?
First and most memorable pet was my collie when I was a kid, from my very first memory, who his name was Banner. And I tell a story about him in the book.
Yeah, Banner seemed like a pretty great pet based off the book. I also am wondering, because birds come up a lot in the book. So I was wondering if you're a birder.
You know, my younger son, Matthew, is a birder. I don't retain names of birds very well, so it's tough to make a life list of names I don't remember. But yeah, when we moved up here, there's a lot of birds and we have feeders out and we watch them all year. And the most common bird right here is the acorn woodpecker. And they're really peculiar animals. They're just really cranky at other birds and everybody else, but they're very funny. And we're just surrounded by woodpeckers, and it's not a colony. It's one big family. I can't think of the name for that. Right, I understand. And they have storage trees called granaries. They're pine trees and just drilled holes all through and just packed with acorns. That's their bank. That's their wealth. And so the kids are born, but they never leave home, a lot of them, because, you know, the bank is right there. Their money is right there. Yeah. So I remember the bird. It's like it's a dynasty. It's kind of like the Trumps. You know, they stick around.
Okay, I'm going to move on from that. So you in your book even introduced me to some new animals I had never heard of before, like the lizard that's not really a lizard in New Zealand. But I was wondering, like, what one really interesting animal fact stands out when you were researching your book that you didn't know before you started writing A Wild Calling, and you were just like, wow, I had no clue that that animal could do that or that this happened?
You know, it's hard to pick, because one of my goals when I wrote this book was to have a forehead slapper fact on every page. And so the one that comes to mind is a study of horses. And they found through digital photography that horses have more facial expressions than dogs. But they're also minute, and also their face acts more like a human being's than a dog does. But there's all this stuff going on that we really don't see because it's so fast and minute, you know, flick of an ear or whatever. And probably horse whisperers are just really tuned into that for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the reasons why horses are used so much now in animal-assisted therapy.
Yeah, I have always sort of been fascinated with horse racing, not the gambling aspect of it, but just it's an example of a human animal relationship where you have to be so in tune with one another. And that dynamic of horse racing has always really intrigued me, how you are a team with an animal, or dog sled racing or things like that. But I think the endurance athlete in me always loves this idea of doing those efforts with an animal partner. So let's dive into some of the concepts and thoughts that you bring up in your book, which was really beautifully written. I mean, there were so many moments when your language or you reference people who were poets or theologians, and so much of this book was really just beautiful. I don't remember another book recently that I've underlined quite as much as this one. But we start by just talking about this innate and natural connection that humans have with animals. And then you expound upon, and you just referenced this a little bit, but the therapeutic properties. And I think all of us, after the past year, could use some therapy, especially that's free and accessible. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the studies or some of the proven therapies that come along with spending time with animals or connecting with animals?
Well, animal-assisted therapy is one of the fastest growing areas of therapy. And this is often done for kids with disabilities. And but it's increasingly done with people with that need some psychological help. And it's usually domestic animals that are used. Usually dogs and horses, goats are a distant third, I think. But there's a lot of research on that shows the benefits for that kind of therapy. And now we have the whole emotional support animal movement and all of that, and that has controversies. But we always have to, I think, respect the fact that people get the help they feel they need. And if, I'm not against having animals on airplanes, for instance. Some people are. But I think it gets people out of themselves. I mean, it may be just that simple. And during the pandemic, it's not just after the pandemic, it's during the pandemic. And I wrote a piece about this, an op-ed for the LA Times. It ran in July, if anybody wants to look it up. And during the pandemic, suddenly people were looking out their window and realizing there were birds out there. Now they knew there were birds out there, but they never really noticed them to the degree they can. And they noticed nature right outside there. They noticed that nature isn't just Yosemite. They saw animals showing up they'd never seen before. And you saw all the pictures of all the stories about the lions walking down the road through a city. It turns out those animals weren't new to the city, most of them. In the book, I talk about the betweens who live in cities, but they're wild animals. They moved into cities in great numbers as we've moved into their territory in great numbers. And what happened was most of those animals that move into our cities were diurnal when they made their living in the day before, some of them. But when they come into a city, they become nocturnal. So we don't see them. They become much more careful. There's some evidence that normally aggressive predators become gentler when they move into cities. And, it's self-preservation because they don't want to be noticed. And so when we left the streets, when we pulled inside, they came out. And people had an odd reaction to that. You would think they would be scared, but I didn't read very many stories where people were scared. I read stories where people, and these are my words, kind of get a glimpse of the way the city could be, a glimpse of the way the future could be, in which we lived in symbiosis with other animals. And I think you started by asking about the therapy. I think during the pandemic, people have taken great comfort in finding those birds outside the window. Suddenly they don't feel as alone. And we can get into that later, but I think that's one of the more important issues I focused on in the book, which is human loneliness.
Yeah, our family was fascinated last spring because we live in downtown Asheville, and we knew there were black bears and turkeys in our neighborhood, but they would walk down our street during the quarantine. And especially when you felt disconnected from even your neighbors, it was so nice to have that life come to you. So here's a question. So our family's always traveled a lot, and we did have a fish, and we kept that fish alive for 18 months, which I'm very proud of. But we do not have a pet right now. And there were parts I was reading your book and I was like, okay, either I'm a bad mom, or maybe we should get a pet, or if we can't do a pet, maybe we should do wildlife rehabilitation because it is more temporary than, a full-time pet. But do you think families should have pets? Is that like a strong recommendation of yours after writing this book and doing your research?
Well, I'm so sorry I made you feel bad, Jennifer. Last person on earth I want to make you feel bad. I think pets are good for families. Now, whether every family should have a pet, some families should not. But when we moved up to the mountains here about 2.5 years ago, and we moved to the house we're in here for about 2 years ago, and Kathy and I've always had pets most of the time. And our last pets were like a decade ago. It was a dog and a cat. And, I didn't want to have another one because it was one too many last trips to the vet, But then I decided I wanted another one. Kathy wanted one. And we looked and looked for a dog. I'm very particular about dogs. Probably my dog Banner is an impossible act to follow. We can talk about him later. So we ended up looking at all kinds of things, and we couldn't find a dog because during the pandemic, the shelters have emptied out of foster animals and all of that. They're still out there, but it got harder to find them. We ended up with 2 cats that were strays that wandered into somebody's yard here, and the dogs treed them. They were kittens. And our neighbor said, well, do you want 2 kids? I know you're looking for pets. And my wife said, well, I'll talk to Rich. Let us think about this overnight. She says, okay, you think about it, but tomorrow you come get the cats. So we did. And their names are Piccolo Pete and Mr. Hightop. And he insists that we spell out Mr., like Mr. Rogers. And they're very funny. They keep us awake at night. They're lively, and it's done great things. Not for our sleep, but for our attitude. They're so funny. I mean, you just can't think about the pandemic when your cat is doing something ridiculous and you're watching. So that's a long answer.
No, that's good. I definitely think, like you said, that the trend of more people getting pets during the pandemic is this like need to connect with other living beings. We had pandemic chicks for a while, but we knew after 3 months we were going to take them to our friend's farm. But it was a great, short-term project to have and have that connection. I called them our therapy chicks at that point because I was like, these are the only living beings besides us that my children get to hug on and touch at that point. So we were really grateful for that. So you introduced me to a new word, a new term in your book. And it seemed even like there was a lot of different feelings about this concept among biologists, animals lovers. And so the concept is anthropomorphism. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping that you can tell us more about anthropomorphism and maybe also a little bit about the controversy that surrounds it.
First, I want to say something about your last question. I think there are some families that need pets and kids that need pets, and often they're the kids that are having difficulties. Maybe their parents are having difficulties. But the pets, dogs give unconditional love, and more than people do. And one of the reasons Banner was so important to me is my parents were having some problems, and I ended up spending much of my boyhood in the woods with Banner, my dog. And my parents often didn't know where I was, but Banner always did. And I tell in the book about how I make the case that he taught me some ethics. Anyhow, in terms of anthropomorphism, that is a controversial word. People are starting, including some scientists, are starting to have second thoughts about having made that word and that concept taboo. Basically, what it means is that projecting human qualities onto other animals. And some of that argument makes a lot of sense to me. If you're, dressing your poodle up in a dress, you are projecting qualities to the poodle that kind of take the poodle's poodleness away. And the dogness of a dog matters. So the more we try to make them like us or pretend they are us, they get cornered in that, and we miss out on that. So the kids. However, having said that, the more science knows about how animals communicate, including wild animals, within their species, but also across species, as well as trees. We've all been reading about that, how much we now know about how trees communicate. The more we know about that, the closer we are to them, in a sense, that the specialness of the human species is being reduced daily. The more we learn about other species. I mean, tools, we're the only species to make tools. That one got disproved, decades ago, I think. So there's a guy that teaches, his last name is Bergdorf, and I'm trying to remember his first name. He's a scientist, and he teaches what he calls critical anthropomorphism. And what that means is, he says, if you're going to study a snake, you have to sit with the snake. You have to get to know the snake. And he has kind of a two-step approach to that. This is what he teaches his college students. He said, when you're with that snake, first conjure up all the science in your mind that you know about that snake, the hard science. What is it doing with its tongue? How does it perceive the world to the degree that we know in terms of hard science? And he says, then the second step right away is to use your imagination. What's it like to be that snake? We have things in our background, in our lives, that we can kind of understand that snake through. That's called empathy. Have some empathy for the snake. That's on top of the hard science. And he said, the interesting thing he says about this is that if you do that, those two steps, you're far more likely to ask better scientific questions about the snake. But first you have to become the snake.
Yeah, I like that idea of, seeing yourself through the eyes of the animal, and like you said, using your imagination to perceive why they're acting a certain way or responding a certain way. Because we observe a lot, but I haven't put myself in the animal's position yet. So I think that'll be a fun thing for our entire family, because I see kids really connecting with that too. Like, let's not just watch the frogs, let's be the frogs. Although my kids like to jump around like frogs anyway. So that was really cool. And, it was interesting because technology comes up in the book a lot. And some of it I thought was so interesting and cool, like this idea that maybe we will even more than we have right now, like crack this code when it comes to dolphin communication or elephants, and in partnership with animals, sort of allow them to communicate to us. Like you were saying, I think it was the elephants who can sense trouble coming, and they could alert us somehow using technology. And then on the other hand, some of the technology you mentioned in the book makes me feel super uncomfortable, especially when it comes to like reproducing animals or having these artificial intelligent robots replace our connection with animals in our house. So can you talk about just sort of the pros and cons of technology when it comes to animal connection and what's happening with it?
Well, right now you can buy robot pets, little robot dogs. And at first that seems ridiculous, but assisted living places that deal with people with dementia have found those very useful. Something to hug, it's soft, it's furry, it moves. So there's some applications of that are a good thing, but to the extent that we try to superimpose technology on other animals, we do lose the animal in the process, in a way. One of the strangest things is there are people working on special vests and leashes for dogs. So that when the dog goes and sniffs something, there's technology in there that will be able to kind of tell what he's sniffing and other things. And so you're essentially communicating with your dog through this leash. And I think that's ridiculous because we've had probably 30,000 years of coevolution. We know what our dogs are saying. And so some of that is extraneous. And there's other examples that are more disturbing than that. But the upside is there's a guy studying, you mentioned coding, studying prairie dogs. And he's done this with a bunch of animals where he's recorded their language, what they're putting out. And then he runs it through a computer program and he codes it as to what this sound means, until he develops almost a language for that creature. He says prairie dogs by far have the most complicated language of the ones that he's tested. And so he thinks that at some point, and by the way, prairie dogs, the one at the edge of the prairie dog town, the prairie dog, he or she can see a person coming and communicate to the other prairie dogs, and it goes down the line until all of them know it. That there's a man coming, he's wearing a hat and he has a white shirt. I mean, it's that detailed. He thinks that on down the line, he'll be able to develop this computerized interpretation of the language in a way that would allow it to be two-way. And we would speak into a machine and it would come out in prairie dog and we would understand what they're saying. Again, I think that is fascinating, but a bit extraneous, because so much of the communication I write about between people and animals in the book is not language as we know it, but it is the sensing of another being in ways that we're not accustomed to. And that once we start doing that, you can't stop. I want to encourage you on your long hikes, Jennifer, to start practicing some of the stuff that's in the book. It'll make your hikes a lot more interesting. And I'm sure they're fascinating just because you're there. So.
Well, yeah, I don't do as many long hikes, but I mean, so much of what you mentioned in the book are things that I just want to do at home with my kids. And one concept you talk about in the book is a sit spot, where you have a certain place and you go there over time and you just sit and you're more than an observer, you're a participant in what's going around you, but it helps connect you to the network you know, the animal network around you, and you can track your observations. And yeah, I was wondering if you had a sit spot where you live.
I'm more, do I have a sit spot? That's interesting. I have a walk spot. It's the whole, I try to walk every day, and you
Yeah.
can't avoid animals. They're all over the place. So, uh, no, I don't have one walk sit spot, but that's a concept that's promoted by a guy named John Young that I write about in the book, who is a nature connection mentor to people. And he'll take 100 people out into the forest to learn bird language, not how to talk like a bird, but to understand what the different alarm sounds are, to understand how they're communicating with each other, but also how the ground squirrel is mimicking them, and they talk back and forth using a common language across species. So anyhow, I veered off your question.
No, that's fine. I just thought that was a really neat concept, and one that, although I prefer, based off my background, your walk spot to a sit spot, but I really liked the idea of that. So there was one point in your book where I laughed out loud, and it was because I was reading about the crows and how smart crows were and how mischievous they were and how they like to play games and how they had different calls to represent different things. And as soon as I finished reading the section about the crows, a crow cawed outside my window, like right outside my window. And it just made me laugh. Like there was this sense that I was reading about crows, right? And it was probably coincidental, but there were so many encounters in this book where connection with animals do feel almost supernatural or almost spiritual. And you talk about different spiritual beliefs in the book, and reference a lot indigenous beliefs, which present a very, very healthy relationship with animals and with nature. And you even mentioned that a lot of these indigenous cultures don't have a word for nature. And I'm wondering if you can share like why that is and what your thoughts on that are.
Well, first, the crow did know you were on page 256. 12% of my sales are to crows. Tell me, ask the question, that last part again.
Yeah, so a lot of the connection that comes up in the book is supernatural or spiritual, you know, and people would report these encounters or moments. And there was a lot that wasn't scientific about it. It was almost like a faith thing of you had to like believe that there was this connection or that this moment happened between you and an animal. But then you also talk specifically about culture and religion, and specifically like indigenous beliefs about our place in the environment, and how nature is really a new word for a lot of purposes. Like a lot of the indigenous cultures never had a word for nature because it indicated it was separate. So I just wanted you to maybe talk about that because I thought it was so interesting.
Well, this whole issue, I mean, I've written 4 books about what I've called nature deficit disorder, and Last Child in the Woods was the first one. And in each of those books, I deal with this tough question about what is nature. It's part of the reason until recently, now the research has just skyrocketed in terms of the benefits of people. But when I wrote Last Child there, I could find about 60 studies I trusted enough to cite. Today, there's well over 1,000. If you go to the Children Nature Network, which is childrenandnature.org, we've assembled a library of independently written summaries of all the research we can find, still coming in 10, 15, 20 a month from somewhere in the world. That was ignored pretty much until 15 years ago. And now there's research all over the place. But one of the hard questions, and one of the reasons there was so little research, is I worked with some neuroscientists 15 years ago who were studying brain architecture development in young children, and I was there to try to help them communicate what they were learning. And I asked them one day, and I was working on this book, on Last Child in the Woods, and I asked them one day, look, you're studying all kinds of things like how daycare good or bad effects brain architecture, literally the structure of the brain in young children, or parent-child attachment. There were or violence in the neighborhood. There was a list of things they were studying. I said, have you ever studied how the experiences in the natural world affect brain architecture development? And they looked at me with a blank face and said, what's nature? And I understand they have a hard time defining it. You know, it is hard to define. But I said to the neuroscientists, this isn't brain surgery. Come up with a hypothesis. You guys do this all the time. The irony was that they already got the concept and didn't really realize it. They were doing experiments in labs. Control, you know, here they were testing, stressing out some animal, poor animal. Over here, they had a control group of animals in what the scientists considered a more natural environment within the lab, what they considered nature. The minute you ask these scientists to step outside the lab, they were lost. So that's one of the reasons why there was so little research on this. But it is true that our language is tricky. The minute we say the word nature and connecting to nature, it implies that we are disconnected. The way I've worked that out is that there has been this vast disconnection from the natural world, not only of children, but from adults, particularly in the last few decades. It has profound implications for psychological and physical health, for cognitive functioning. So we have to talk about that disconnection, even though we are part of nature. So when in our wild calling, I always try to use the phrase other animals. It's not just we're animals. But also, I think that as we have disconnected from the rest of nature, we have disconnected from the nature in ourselves. And that's the source of, I think, more than a little of our human pathology.
Yeah, you know, again, I really think this book, like your other books, has been life-changing, just reading it. And it makes me feel very failed by institutions. I just think our work environment, and right now I borrowed an office because we're in the road, but you can see there's no windows and there's fluorescent lights. And that's an environment where a lot of people will work. And you know, I'm a Christian, and the church I grew up in, I just started thinking, I think the impact that Western Christianity religion had on my relationship with nature and animals was potentially negative, if anything. And then schools have become very, very sterile as well. And so I got to I guess two questions based off that. One, just very personally, do you think like the world's major religions have had a positive or negative impact on our relationship with animals?
Well, it's really mixed, and I hesitate to say that Christianity has been negative in that. I mean, I cite lots of passages in the Bible that are pro-nature and that warn us what will happen if we lose the nature in ourselves. And the Pope a couple 3 years ago was talking to a little boy who had just lost his dog. And the boy was crying, and the Pope said he would meet his dog in heaven. Now that's a first, that dogs would have souls. And later the Vatican did a quick backstep or two, but he said what he said. And I think he's a very sensitive, good man. And I think we know this. I think we know that we're surrounded by deeper consciousness than we recognize. And there are religions that are based very much on the human-animal connection of animism. It's, you know, indigenous religions, there's no separation there. But in terms of the spiritual or the stuff that is not hard science, we can't talk about our relationship with nature, particularly our relationship with other creatures without telling stories. Not everything is told through data. It's one of the reasons we're having a tough time selling activism about climate change, about moving people from knowledge, which is data often, to action. It's because we have forgotten two things. One is, as the great social movements in the past have been based on, which whether it's gay rights or feminism or civil rights to an extent, those are all based on relationship, on love. That's the central core of all of those. With climate change, biodiversity collapse, pandemics, we talk in terms of data. And we gotta have the data, gotta have the science. But the stories we tell contain more of the truth, not the whole truth, but more of it. And with Our Wild Calling, I collected hundreds of stories that people told, and then I picked the representative stories. And people naturally talk about this deep connection with other animals, but they don't talk about it literally, they talk about it symbolically through stories. And many of us have had these experiences, whether it's a relationship with a pet over time, or whether it's an encounter with a wild animal, eye contact with the coyote walking through our yard. It may only last a few seconds, but people tell these stories with great significance. And then the more they tell them to other people, they find the more meaning they find in them, in these stories. This is deep within us. I mean, our ancestors came back from the forest to the campfire at night, and they told stories, animal stories. They became the bear that they were talking about. They danced, they became the bear. This is deep within us. One of the things I hope the book does is encourage families to tell stories, tell animal stories. Around the dinner table that night, any animals cross your path? How did you feel? Did you learn anything from that? Think how interesting so many dinners where we stare at each other would be if we started telling animal stories. Schools too. We've turned biology into math. It's a lot more interesting than that. And often that ends up reducing the interest of students in nature. Students who, as kids, grew up very connected to it, sometimes disconnect around 8th grade because of what we do to biology. So these stories are extraordinarily important. And yes, they do, and I'll tell, if we have time, I'll tell a couple of them to illustrate this, but they do illustrate that there is something that we don't fully understand, and it has everything in the world to do with our loneliness as a species.
So you mentioned schools, and that was really, I mean, that was where I was left at the end of the book, of saying, okay, the way we need to address this sense of loneliness, this habitat depletion, the species collapse, is we really have to get this in the schools. And I was just wondering, you work very closely with Children's Nature Network, and are you all developing any sort of curriculum or something? Like, there's a lot of schools now that are STEM school, which is science, technology, engineering, math, but it seems like there needs to be this environmental curriculum that's introduced kindergarten through 12th grade that keeps youth engaged and informed and connected. And so is that out there already? Are you working on something like that? Do you have resources for parents or teachers or people who work in academics to use?
Well, the Children's Nature Network is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods, and its purpose is to support all the good people like you that are out there that are helping build a movement to reconnect this generation and future generations of children to the natural world. There's a lot happening. I mean, there's a lot of pediatricians are starting to prescribe nature. The increase in the number of nature-based preschools is phenomenal. Progress is being made. The Children's Nature Network isn't the kind of organization that can create a curriculum, but we can report on what other people are doing. If you go to that webpage, there's quite a bit of interesting things that are going on in education too, even though it's slower in public education than it is sometimes in private education.
Okay, I have so many questions, but I have to open it up to our audience members too. I usually get a lot of texts from folks who've asked questions on Facebook. So if you're watching this on Facebook, I have someone texting me questions there. I also, based off the education and curriculum question, Rich, there's a middle school science teacher who asked, how would you encourage teachers to get our students more connected with nature? I have many students who absolutely refuse to go outside because they believe it is a terrifying place.
Yeah. There's a list of things that have disconnected children from nature. One of them is bad urban design. We get preached at as parents, taking kids for a walk. Walk where in many of these neighborhoods? You will run into a freeway, you'll run, or the park isn't safe, or any number of things that have to do with urban design and also municipal governance. But one of the most important barriers is fear of stranger danger. That's not going to get any better anytime soon unless we really face that very directly. For at least 4 decades, the number of stranger abductions and murders of children, that number was going down. And in fairly small number, one is too many. But because of 24-hour coverage, news coverage of that few cases, we think there's 1,000 of them happening every day all around us. And kids pick up our fear. And I never pretend that there's safety outside the front door. But I do think we need to think in terms of comparative fear. This applies to schools and families. Yes, there is danger all the time in life. And there's danger when we go out into the neighborhood and the woods and all of that. But there's also huge danger in sitting on that couch too long. The danger of child obesity, the danger of the psychological disconnection from a sense of community, the danger to democracy itself. Believe it or not, in order to have a good democracy, you got to have people that go out and get to know their neighbors, including their animal neighbors and their plant neighbors. So I think that's a place to start, is to acknowledge that there's nature, there's danger, but there are also ways to deal with it. And some of them are kind of funny. I mean, a lot of parents don't want their kids to get muddy, and they worry about the kids going outside and picking up some disease, I guess, from the grass. I visited one school. It was an independent school that was nature-based. They did a lot of their learning outside. And I entered this room, and there were these what looked like hazmat suits all along the wall. And these were suits that the kids put on and zipped up over their regular clothes so they could go out and get as muddy as they wanted. And they came back in, they took the suits off. One of the things that your teacher has asked brings up the need for teaching schools, for schools that turn out young teachers, to start teaching teachers how to get their kids outdoors and start teaching them the cognitive benefits that kids learn. Many of them learn much better outdoors about everything, not just about nature, biology. They need to know about that. Some teachers are learning that, and they're changing the way they're teaching.
You know, one thing I noticed in your book is that the connection that you talk about with animals and nature comes from a place of vulnerability. And I thought about my own experience outdoors and some of the animals I was most afraid of when I started going out and hiking, like really scared of bears. You know, now they're my favorite. A black bear is my favorite animal to see outdoors. I was scared of mountain lions. I still say I have a real healthy respect of mountain lions, but you talk about memorable encounters. It was seeing a mountain lion. Like it is one of the top memories of my life. And I think, you know, we have to be able to feel vulnerable, like you said. And if anything, this past year has maybe taught us the danger of the safety of indoors and how that makes us feel after a year. So I love that. And I loved everything you said about the habitat of the heart. It was so powerful. Someone from Facebook said, you mentioned you had stories to tell. Can you tell us one of your animal stories?
Sure. You know, they're like Fritos. It's hard to tell just one. Three stories that I'll try that are interrelated. I'll try to keep short. The longest one is first. There's an oceanographer that tells a story early in the book, and he's a famous oceanographer among oceanographers. His name is Paul Dayton. He works at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He's about 80 now. And he'll tell this story now because he says, I'm 80, I don't care what people think anymore. And this is a story that he says, would get him invited out of some scientific conferences. He was on the bottom of the ocean one day as a student at the University of Washington. And he was collecting samples of starfish for his project. And he felt something really big. He's facing the sand, felt something really big come above him and stop. That's usually not a good sign. And he looked up and he saw a big tentacle coming down and another one over here. And then he looked up and said it was one of those 12-foot wingspan giant Pacific Ocean octopuses. And at the risk of anthropomorphizing, he said, the octopus decided that I was a clam and it came down and got me. And it did. It wrapped him in its arms. He said people think those arms are soft, anything but. He couldn't budge him. Around that time, he realized he was running out of oxygen. And he did what prey often does in the mouth of the predator, the gazelle does in the mouth of the lion. He relaxed mysteriously, just relaxed, involuntarily relaxed. And the octopus kind of relaxed himself. So Paul seized the moment. He pushed off the bottom of the ocean as hard as he could. He and the octopus start going up the column of water. And as they're going up, he can feel the octopus moving around his body. And he can feel the razor sharp beak of the octopus moving around his neck. You squirmed. I love telling this story because in a live audience, people always squirm. And then finally, he's looking into the eye of the octopus. And he said, something happened. He can't explain it. And he laughs at himself when he says this. He says, I think we made our non-aggression pact because the octopus relaxed a little bit more and moved back and they retained eye contact. And right around there, they both hit the surface of the water. And Paul rips off his mask. He's gasping for air. He looks down as the octopus starts to sink and he sees the octopus is still looking at him and they're still maintaining eye contact. What does Paul do next? This is the best part of the story. He puts his mask back on and he chases the octopus back down into the depths of the water until he runs out of breath. And by the way, as they went down, he told me this detail that's not in the book. He told me this later. I wish I'd gotten it in. As he went down in the water with the octopus, they spiraled each other. And then he ran out of breath, went back up. I said, Paul, why in the world would you do such a thing? That's crazy. And he doesn't have a good explanation. He's a hardcore scientist, highly respected. And he used the word spiritual. He says, I don't know if it was really spiritual, but it felt like what spiritual is supposed to feel like. And he said, what I knew for sure is I did not want those moments to end. I heard that again and again in the stories that people told me about their encounters with wild animals. Second story, this is about a pet. A mother in Toronto told me that she walked in the living room one day and her 6-year-old son was stretched out on the carpet with their big dog named Jack. And he had his arm around the dog. And she heard her 6-year-old say, Mommy, I don't have a heart anymore. And she said, what are you saying? And without looking up, her son said, my heart is in Jack. What is that? What's that permeability? in which that division goes away. We feel that with people sometimes, if we're lucky. I think we feel that with animals too, and not only our pets. We feel that with wild animals, even if it's just a few seconds. Last story, very quick. Sorry, 3 stories. I was on a lake once. I have a little boat with a little electric motor, and I saw on the shore what I thought were vultures. And I wanted to look at them. They were eating a carp. I got up close to them, got within 20 feet of them, the quiet motor. You don't usually get within 20 feet of giant golden eagles. And that's what they were. And for what seemed like forever, the eagles would go down, take a bite, look up at me. I mean, we never lost eye contact. It seemed to go on forever. And that's one of the characteristics of these stories. People go into what can only be called altered states. One of them is time disappears or bends. It happened for Paul, happened for me. Another one is your sense of scale shifts radically, or can. I went home and told my younger son, who was home from college, about that. And I said, I don't have any explanation, but something changed. And whoever I say I am, Matthew, I'm not. Whoever I really am is who I was in those moments with those eagles. And I don't have the language to describe it. The closest I could get in terms of modern literature about this was Martin Buber, the great philosopher. I always have to be careful not to say Justin Bieber. Martin Buber wrote a great essay called I and Thou. It was about people. He said, you and I, Jennifer, don't really exist. What exists is right here. It's between us. It's the relationship. Without that, we really don't exist. He meant that a little differently than most people use the word. He thought of that as a kind of electricity that some people call God. And that's what I felt. That's what Paul felt. That's what all these people that I interviewed, one way or another, that's what they were describing. You know, I like to name things. So this doesn't have a name with animals. So I call it the habitat of the heart. And I think there are 2 habitats. But the first is the physical, natural habitat that we spend so much time and effort, as we should, protecting and nurturing and telling our kids about. The second habitat is the habitat of the heart. And we spend very little time talking about that, recognizing it, telling stories about it, telling our kids about it, protecting it. But here's the deal. If one of those habitats goes, so does the other one. I think this has to do with the future of environmentalism and our survival on Earth. We have to start focusing not only on protecting the physical habitat of nature, we have to protect and nurture the habitat of the heart.
So that leads me to our last question today. And again, I'm sorry, I feel like I took up most of the time with my questions, but I just love the book, love learning about this. I want to mention before I share this last question, at the end of our Wild Calling, you have 10 action steps of what people can do to protect the habitat of the heart, protect the natural habitat. And I love that the book isn't just stories and feelings, which are important, but then it tells you how to move forward and lean into that. And the last question I have is, what is the most important thing, if you had to pick one thing that we can do to protect animals?
First, pay attention. So much of this stuff happens because we're not paying attention. And we didn't even talk about our species loneliness, but that's another issue we have to pay attention to. At the end of the book, in fact, the last page, I talk about a basic principle that I think we need to adopt. And it's called the reciprocity principle. If I could read a few sentences to describe it. Beyond our individual relationships, our times call for the adoption of a basic principle that embraces both survival and joy as we repair our relationship with the natural world. We might call this the reciprocity principle. For every moment of healing that humans receive from another creature, humans shall provide an equal moment of healing for that animal and its kin. For every acre of wild habitat we take, we will preserve or create at least another acre for wildness. For every dollar we spend on classroom technology, we will spend at least another dollar creating chances for children to connect deeply with another animal, plant, or person. For every day of loneliness we endure, we'll spend a day in communion with the life around us until the loneliness passes away.
That was more of the underline. I feel like half the book was underlined, but it was such a beautiful end. And again, I want to thank you. I want to highly, highly recommend Our Wild Calling for everyone. I think especially for teachers and parents, this is such a critical book. And if you'd like to buy one of the books, Rich was kind enough, he's signed, he's autographed a bunch of copies of Our Wild Calling that are available at blueridgehikingco.com. So I'll try to add a link for that on Facebook and in the Zoom. And then I hope that you join us next month, first Thursday in May, and we are going to interview J.R. Harris, the author of Way Out There, and hear about his adventures all over the globe. So anyways, this has been a thrill for me. This book, like I said, I do not say this about every book. I believe this one is life-changing. Rich, I have so many more questions for you. I'm sad I didn't get to them all, but I really want to thank you for the gift that you've given us with your beautiful writing and all your research and all the insights and everything you're doing with Children's Nature Network. And as a sign off, if you could just tell us, we know to look you up at richardlouv.com, and then we encourage people to check out Children's Nature Network. Is there any other resource or link that you want to share before we end our session today?
Those are good ones.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoy your walk today. Let us know what.
Oh, thank you. I need one today. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thanks, Rich. Thanks, everyone. See you in May.
Thanks, Jeff.